Good afternoon. If I could have your attention for just a moment. My name is Steve Edwards. I am not only the host of 848, which is a public affairs program on Chicago Public Radio, but a proud parishioner here at Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral, for those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting. And on behalf of His Eminence Archbishop Job, Bishop of Chicago and the Midwest, and all of us here at Holy Trinity, we welcome you here today to the Cathedral on what is truly a very special occasion. This event, as some of you may know, is part of a series of events that's taking place throughout the city of Chicago during a 6-week celebration called Sullivan at 150. And as part of this, Holy Trinity is teaming up with a series of different organizations, the Chicago History Museum, the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs, the Illinois Arts Council, the Chicago Architecture Federation, and many, many others to celebrate the life and work of Louis Sullivan, the architect who designed this great cathedral. So the fact that all of you can be here today to celebrate that and the beauty of this glorious cathedral is truly a special day indeed. I want to introduce a few people, but before I do that, I just wanted to point out that in our program we have a list of events that will take place during this afternoon. We will begin in just a few minutes with a lecture, and then we will move next door to our rectory, where we will have a buffet of traditional ethnic foods, and then we will return here to the cathedral for a performance by the Pan-Orthodox Choir of Chicago. And if you haven't had the opportunity to hear the Pan-Orthodox Choir, you're in for a real treat. For those of you that have heard, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, I was just talking with Tim Samuelson, who will be doing the lecture in just a moment, and he said, you know, the way to truly experience the fullness of a building is to hear its acoustics, to hear it sort of in situ, as it were, and we'll have a chance to do that in a little while. I want to recognize a few people without whom this event wouldn't take place. First and foremost, Archpriest John Adamcho. Father John, thank you so much for your leadership on all of this. Thanks as well to our Parish Council President, Nick Zarebny, who made this event a reality and teamed up with the Sullivan at 150 individuals. Also thanks to Debbie Dodge and John Russick for their leadership on this. John, I know you've been at the helm of this from the beginning, bringing all of these Sullivan-oriented organizations together, so thank you very much for letting us participate in all of this. One final note, this is part of an effort that we are undertaking here at Holy Trinity, not just to celebrate Louis Sullivan and the 150th anniversary of his birth, but also an opportunity for us to continue the ongoing restoration of this cathedral. Your contributions today are extremely helpful in that regard, and if there are others here who are interested in continuing helping those efforts along, we encourage you to do so, and you can see Father John for more information about that. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting or hearing Tim Samuelson, you also are in for a treat, because Tim is one of the most knowledgeable and most articulate historians on the Chicago scene. He is a master storyteller. He is a dear friend to this cathedral, a friend to our radio program, and most of all, I think, a friend to all who love Louis Sullivan. He is, without question, one of, if not the foremost experts on the work of Louis Sullivan. He has kindly agreed to come here today to talk to us about Louis Sullivan and this beautiful house under a lecture that we're calling Louis Sullivan and the Saints. So would you please welcome Tim Samuelson, cultural historian for the city of Chicago.
Nobody ever accused me of talking softly. Anyway, can you hear me okay? It should, because the acoustics in here are wonderful. So I'm happy to give a demonstration of that in action throughout this talk. It's really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you about Holy Trinity Orthodox Cathedral, one of the great buildings of Chicago, one of the great buildings of the country, one of the great buildings of the world. It's a monument in so many different ways. It is so rich in history that the layers are incredible, that it could stand as a historical building for almost any one of the different aspects that I'm going to talk to you about. One of the things that I always like with history is a story, and not just dry facts and names, but the story of people and how things were created, and people, how they lived, and how it's manifested in buildings. And almost as a storyline. And I cannot think of a building that has a more interesting story than this one. It's almost like you're going to think I made it up. Where else are you going to get the story of a building, which you are sitting in right now, which is here through the direct intervention of personages that would include 2 canonized saints of the Orthodox Church, one of the greatest architects of the late 19th, early 20th century, the Tsar of Russia, and Buffalo Bill. They all had a hand in this building. Now, one of the reasons that we have this function here today is to celebrate Louis Sullivan. So we talked about the great internationally acclaimed architect. And of course, that is Mr. 150th birthday was not that long ago, in which there are now celebrations across the country. One of the sad things about Louis Sullivan is he was misunderstood in his lifetime, and he was misunderstood after he passed away. And there was a real wonderful beauty and kind of inspirational energy to his story that gets lost altogether. When you see books that are written about him or articles, it will say, Louis Sullivan, father of modern architecture or prophet of modern architecture. And people will talk about him as being this modernist who supposedly threw away the past and created something new. That wasn't what he was all about. He was about it, but he arrived at it in an entirely different matter. Also, one of the most unfortunate things I think Sullivan would say, if he could come back and play back history and change something, there's one quote that people always bring up for Louis Sullivan, and that is, form follows functions, the one you see listed on the T-shirts and whatnot, which is a true quotation, but it's been misinterpreted completely over the years, so people don't understand what he meant. Sullivan was as much an architect as somebody who was trying to pass along an idea that could go to every person from all walks of life, no matter what your background is, your profession, that what's really important is that every individual, after all, you as human beings are part of nature. We are living entities. And we also have the ability to think, to reason, and therefore to create. And so this is something that as a manifestation of this living being to be able to do this, that actually every human being can become an extension of nature and then bring things to life. And if you are an architect, that means taking out of yourself your life experience, things you have learned, your education, things you have cumulatively gathered throughout your life and your career, that you can create these buildings. You can take brick, stone, terracotta that are inert, seemingly dead materials, and you can bring them to expressive life. And you can make it not only as your own creation, but one that serves the type of building that it is supposed to be. Almost custom tailored, like a fine fitting suit of clothes, so that Sullivan could get into the nature of the client and the spirit of what the building was to be, give it his own unique expression that would serve its use entirely. And that every part of it would be part of one organic whole. It's just an example. If you take a seed and you put it in the ground, it is nurtured by the ground. And what is the ground but the decay of the past? And it nurtures the seed and it grows. And let's say a plant grows up and let's say it moves towards the light. Every plant, let's say it's a beautiful rose, and it grows up the leaves and then it blossoms and opens up to the sun, because the sun, in maybe some case, comes in this way. The plant rises up to meet it. Now, you can look at this rose and say, oh, isn't that beautiful? And it smells so good, too. But you could take that rose and you could analyze it. You could put it under a microscope and see how the leaves, the green, the roots, the way it relates to the ground is part of one organic living thing. So it has a beauty that will impress you, and you'll get an emotional reaction to, or the smell of it. But at the same time, every part of it is something that's alive. That's the way Sullivan created a building. And so when he got a job to do a building, he would learn everything that he could about what the building was to be. He would find out how much there was to spend. And then he knew from his experience what kind of materials were there, what you could put together to create a building that would serve the needs of the requirements and the budget and all aspects of what it's supposed to be. Now, this is the amazing thing. He would work it all out in his mind completely almost before he'd ever set pencil to paper. And then he would rapidly sketch it out. Sometimes he'd even get his client, he'd say, I'm now going to show you what your building's going to be. He'd make a little sketch. And it wasn't just drawing a plan and an elevation and saying, here's your outside, here's your inside. At that point, he could tell you what the structure was, how you span the roof, how you heat it, the costs of each. It was a total idea. So it was all about a complete, harmonious system of thinking. And by this system of thinking, you can then create buildings as a whole, but through your own emotions, you can give an emotional life to the buildings that will make, even if you know nothing about architecture, because Sullivan knew the majority of people walking down the street, they don't know about architecture or engineering or philosophy, but the idea of a building that someone might just stop and look and get pleasure from it. And experience for the people who use the building to get an experience. And of course, for a church, this was the ideal forum to be able to do it. Now, to get back to the one thing that probably Sullivan is sorry he said, was form follows function. And people actually starting in the 1930s tried to kind of take Sullivan and relate him to the modernist works that were being done and the work of the Bauhaus, to say that first you have the function and then the form is secondary. What Sullivan really meant was that form and function were one. It was an organic whole. So it's kind of sad. So sometimes when you see people wearing one of those Sullivan t-shirts and it says form follows function, I always want to go up and say, do you really know what he meant by that? Because the whole beauty of the idea. But by this idea of the cohesive system of thinking, we even know, in fact, there's a story, there's an interview. Sullivan, in his last years, was a member of the Cliff Dwellers Club at Orchestra Hall. And Richard Nickel, the Sullivan historian, interviewed a waiter in the Cliff Dwellers. And he remembered Sullivan coming in to write his autobiography in the 1920s. And he said, Mr. Sullivan used to say to me, Enoch, whatever you do, it is a part of yourself. When you set that table and you put down those plates and you arrange the napkins and the silverware, that's a part of you. So Sullivan felt that this is something that is part of everyone. And even this man, recalling this was something that he would have experienced in the 1920s, and he remembered it and valued it distinctly when he recounted it in 1958. So that's really the essence of Sullivan. So in thinking of buildings this way, in creating them in your mind, taking in all aspects of what the building's to be, budget, materials, and then poetically abstracting them and creating them in your mind, you actually then make an amazing living building that Sullivan did not want to be remembered as a modern architect. That wasn't his message. However, what he wanted to be remembered for was a process of thinking of which modernism was the natural result. That's the difference. And by doing this, every person, by the ability to do this, be it an architect or whatever you do, you could create out of yourself and make something different. And every building and every creation would be different, personal, and expressive. So that's what the story was. Now, we're talking about Sullivan, 150 years. In fact, this is a story of a young man who came to Chicago, 17 years old, stepped off the train. Chicago was still, in 1873, it was still partially in ruins from the fire. A dynamic city that had built up almost overnight, basically from a mud hole to a metropolis, 50 people in 1830, 300,000 in 1870. And over 1 million by 1890. A city that's literally falling all over itself growing up, but it also was a city of dynamics in a city with no set traditions. And so people who were creative were able to come here and do things in the field of architecture, commerce, and break the rules and do creative things in Chicago because nobody was here to tell them not to. So Sullivan comes to Chicago. He says he stepped off the train. He looked at the city before him still in ruins. He probably felt the energy of the place, stomped his foot, put his hand up in the air, and he said, "This is the place for me," and this is where he stayed for the rest of his life. Now, Sullivan had formulated over the years much of the philosophy that I told you about. He was very interested in philosophy. He had read works of Thoreau, Emerson, which all explored the relationship of human beings in relation to nature, interested in Darwin and science, and this all became a part of him. And he had a very unconventional view of architecture. In fact, unlike many architects who did kind of just look through pattern books and put together buildings that looked to the past, Sullivan formulated over time this approach of creating buildings out of himself, time, place, circumstance, and technology, and giving them expressive form. In the early years, he didn't get that many jobs. He was very lucky to be able to go into partnership with Dankmar Adler, who was already an established architect in Chicago, and his father was the rabbi of one of the largest and most influential Jewish congregations in the city, KAM, which later became Pilgrim Baptist Church, which so tragically burned early this year. And many of the early patrons for the Adler and Sullivan office came from Chicago's Jewish community for mercantile buildings and houses, mostly on the south side of Chicago, many of which are demolished today. Now, Adler was also a master of acoustics, of sound. In fact, Louis Sullivan said he never even could realize how Adler had gotten his grasp of acoustics and sound. He thought it might even be as much instinct or a feel of it, but he knew how to design a theater where you could see, where you could hear, and got the job to remodel a number of theaters in Chicago. And it was still, Adler and Sullivan was still a relatively small office in Chicago when many of the most influential and wealthy citizens of Chicago got together to realize that Chicago needed a grand opera house. And also knowing that art doesn't always pay on its own in Chicago, to combine it with a large office building and hotel, but should make money, and really have a show place for the city. And Ferdinand Peck, the head of the committee who was in charge of building the building, although many of the influential members of the board all wanted to get their favorite pet architects who had established careers and done the big buildings in Chicago, Peck knew to get a good theater you needed Dankmar Adler, and so they hired Adler and Sullivan. Did they care about Sullivan? Not really. He just kind of came along with the package. But when that building was built, it was one of the largest building projects in the United States. And it was a building that, through its form and its details, was one that even when people saw it in illustrations were just totally taken with it. And the fame of it actually spread around the world. And Adler and Sullivan then became an established force in architecture. Now, the one thing about architecture is you think that the way buildings are built, or even back to ancient times of just a stone on a stone on a stone, post and beam, one thing sitting on another, good old gravity. Chicago was a place of dynamic ideas. In fact, because Chicago's downtown was so small, unlike other cities that could expand laterally by swallowing up small areas around it, Chicago had no place to go. You had the river on two sides, the lake on the other, commercial area, the area for the financial district, the stores were small. The only way to go was up. And so that is why Chicago became the birthplace of the skyscraper. It's because Chicago had to develop it here. And what Sullivan did, he didn't design the first skyscraper. In fact, you often see things that say, Louis Sullivan, father of skyscrapers. Yes, he was the father, but you need to know the context of what the paternity was. There were architects who did skyscrapers before him. A skyscraper is a metal-framed building, like a bird cage, which the strength of the frame holds up the building. The masonry is just clipped on. And you can actually put the masonry on from the top down, which actually used to astound people because they used to do it. And many of the architects in doing the early skyscrapers made them look like they were stacked up little buildings. Maybe if you make it like 3 stories of one type and then make it another 3 stories, maybe nobody will notice it's 10 stories tall. Sullivan was one of the people who taught the skyscraper how to soar and actually accentuated not only the geometry of the frame and this cladding the slender metal in just these wonderful slender casings of masonry, but also many of the buildings had this wonderful vertical orientation that reached to the sky, celebrate its height, because part of what Sullivan was for the honesty and the expressiveness of each individual building type. So Adler and Sullivan was a major, very major firm. The firm of Adler and Sullivan was dissolved in 1895 in the midst of a financial panic. Sullivan went on his own. Now, we have talked about Louis Sullivan in the field of architecture with a new approach to architecture. It's a new place in Chicago. It's a new time, new ideas. And so now we will go to Russia. And the other thing that's interesting, we talk about what people think about things. And we talk about the Russian Orthodox Church. And even it's interesting, the understandings that people never sometimes even would get the grasp of what it's all about. In fact, calling it the Russian Orthodox Church, which in a way it is true, but it wasn't all about Russia. It was a specific theology that actually had many different variations and cultures throughout Eastern Europe and elsewhere, but centered in Russia. And so Russia, as being the head of the administration, now let me know if I'm getting this wrong now. Okay, I'm watching you. Okay. That it was administered from Russia, but it actually involved many places and many cultures under the blanket of a theology, a very beautiful theology, and one that goes back. Its traditions are early. In fact, many people have written essays on how the Orthodox Church actually is a very pure and true expression of Christianity, has remained unchanged in the meaning, held on to for a very long time without other things being put upon it. So you have the church being run out of Russia, and there was, of course, a change in the 1880s and the 1890s in particular, when you start to get the immigration of people from Russia and from Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe and coming to the United States. And so came many of the people who were practitioners of the Orthodox faith. And there really weren't many churches or really a large organization to be able to accept this really big change in the number of people who were coming in at the time. So there was a bishop who was in charge of this area. And actually, to give you an idea of kind of the origins of it, he was the bishop of Alaska and the Aleutians and Alaska, because those would be the closest points. But as people came in and needed a place for worship, then there needed to be this evolution. So just like Sullivan had to evolve the skyscraper, you had these pioneers who had to pioneer establishing the Orthodox Church in America. And unlike where you could say, like, just like if you generalize on something, what somebody said, well, gee, all of North America is all kind of the same culture. Well, no, it's not. All the variations that went into the people who practiced the Orthodox faith was not all the same. And when people migrated to this country, it's not like you were able to establish, in many cases, churches where you had people of a like culture would be. It would be people from many different places, but still united by the Orthodox faith. So, there was a man who studied for the priesthood in St. Petersburg. His name was John Kochurov. He was young, he was energetic, and he was very interested in the challenge of what was needed in developing the new growing constituents for Orthodoxy in the United States. And even while he was still in training, before he even was made a priest and still a deacon, he was trying to make arrangements to finish his studies and come to America and tackle this challenge. And so he did in 1895, arrived in Chicago, and took charge of the one major Orthodox church in Chicago known as St. Vladimir's. It was on Racine Avenue just west of downtown Chicago. It met in what was an old converted house. In fact, Father Kachura found this old house where the walls had been enlarged to make a sanctuary, and he, I think, made mention of broken, worn-out furniture to make do. But the congregation was large, the congregation was diverse. Now, he was young, he was 24 years old, and he was very taken with the challenge of developing this church. And he also learned in dealing with the different congregations in outlying areas. There was a congregation out in Streeter, Illinois, where the church was actually made out of a part of the Russian pavilion of the World's Columbian Exposition, where they actually took it, made it the front of the church. In fact, Father John actually learned Slovak in order to address many of the people at Streeter, because there were many Slovak speaking people in that congregation. So he became this one-man dynamo in developing the Orthodox Church in Chicago. Remarkable man. And about this time, there's discussion of building a new church, a cathedral, and whose name comes up for it but none other than L.H. Sullivan. Now, how did he get this job? Probably the most likely, what we're able to find, is early on, Sullivan, and earlier Adler and Sullivan, had done many factory buildings for the Crane Company. You might know the Crane Company. They make plumbing fixtures. They're still in business today, I believe. Sinks and bathtubs, and the Cranes became very wealthy. The factory was in Chicago. Charles R. Crane, who was the son of the founder of the Crane Company, was very interested in Russian history and culture. He was very active in the Russian community, just out of interest in the art, music, poetry, the religion, and he kept in contact with the Russian consulate and was very supportive of things. And it's probably through Charles Crane that Louis Sullivan was brought in to start preparing plans for the cathedral. The earliest reference we have is in the spring of 1897, where it appeared in the paper that Sullivan had prepared plans. So it looks like he had actually started even earlier than that for New Orthodox Church. It was even interesting to see how new this was. Even the esteemed Chicago Tribune didn't quite have a handle on what Orthodoxy was all about. And they reported in one of the papers saying that Louis Sullivan had designed a new building for the synagogue of the Orthodox Church, and the facility will include a home for its rabbi. But we know that Sullivan had made the design. The early descriptions call for a building of brick and stone, though we don't know exactly what it looked like. And as the project was developing, 1898, another person arrives on the scene in our cast of characters, and this is Bishop Tikhon. Now, Father Kachura was this young man, 24-year-old, who was looking after the Midwest and Chicago. And Bishop Tikhon was brought in from Russia to head up the part of the Orthodox Church that was part of the Alaska and the Aleutians. Now, he became the national leader. He would be the head of everything in North America, Alaska, and the Aleutians. In fact, realizing the expanded nature of his responsibility, he had it changed to the Diocese of the Aleutians and North America. And so that then reached out. Now, he was 33 years old at the time when he came in 1898, and this is just when the proposals to build Holy Trinity were starting. And he was another dynamo and powerhouse. In fact, here was this man trying to organize and modernize and make a church that would address its time, its people, but also its heritage at the same time. And he did a lot of his work in where the people a lot of the Eastern Europeans who were in the country, in the West Coast and the East Coast. So he would work out of San Francisco, he worked out of New York, and he was taking trains back and forth and stopping along the way into Chicago and meeting with Father Kachuroff and to see what's happening with the developing church in Chicago that became Holy Trinity. Now there was talk about for money and fundraising, and probably one of the big steps forward in supporting the idea of building a cathedral in Chicago and replacing that little wooden house on Racine Avenue came on December 24th, 1899, when it was reported in the Chicago papers that a gift was made towards the building of a church in Chicago by none other than Tsar Nicholas II. And as the governmental head of Russia, he also then was intimately connected with the church itself, and of course interested in the spiritual well-being of the people who had left the mother country. So he gave money. Actually, the counts vary. I think according to the account books, it looks like it was about $4,000. Some of the newspapers actually said it was about $10,000. And this was seed money for building the building. So, Father Kachuroff in Chicago was busy. Actually, he was very good at reaching out outside of the religious community and going to the people who were the socialites and the people of money and influence, and convincing them of the importance and the significance of the Orthodox Church and building a building for it. He already had Charles Crane on board because he was interested in Russian art and community as well, but also looked to others. I mean, there's even mention of the McCormicks being involved in the McCormick Reaper Works, and of course many of the people that McCormick's depended on for building their farm equipment, their factory, came from Eastern Europe. And so this was an outreach that might have even had some business implications for them as well. But there you have the seed money. This wonderful fundraising is starting. Father Kachuroff went to Russia, fundraised there. There was a man who was the head of the Russian Council in Chicago named Baron Schlippenbach, and he also was someone who was a good conduit in raising money. And among the many things that would happen within the community to raise money, there was just like you often would have with gatherings and picnics and bake sales. In fact, there was organized in 1900 a parade. It was a benefit, and there was a picnic involved. The parade went down Milwaukee Avenue. This was to raise awareness in the community for raising money for Holy Trinity. And who was featured but none other than the Cossack horsemen of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. That's where Buffalo Bill comes into this whole thing. Of course, Buffalo Bill had this wonderful traveling show, which he would actually, in this case, they got a site right across where Comiskey Park is right now. It was vacant, built a temporary grandstand, and they would recreate different Western events. But they also had this group of Russian horsemen known as the Cossack Riders, and they were one of the prides of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show for their precision precision riding. So they marched in the parade, they participated. Of course, this also, I'm sure, Buffalo Bill, the good showman that he was, realized that this might sell some tickets for the Wild West show as well. So Buffalo Bill actually becomes a part of it himself. So now the money is coming in, and Sullivan's redesigning the building, and there's communications going on. Sullivan is working with Father Kachuroff. He is learning about orthodoxy. He is learning about the needs of the church so that Sullivan can absorb into himself what he needs to give back in the form of a tangible, beautiful, emotionally expressive, but also useful, practical church building. And finally, the day comes in the spring of 1902. The cornerstone ceremony is laid in the building. A wooden cross was actually erected on the bare ground right here where the altar is for people to see what was going up. And it took about a year, and by the spring of 1903, the building was complete. It wasn't consecrated until later in 1903, but it was open for services about that time. Now, it's actually a building like people had not seen before. And this is one of the interesting things, too, about Louis Sullivan. One of the other tragedies of Sullivan is people say that Sullivan made things that were modern and threw away the past. Nothing could be farther than the truth. Sullivan believed that the past was part of the heritage to be learned from, and there were lessons in how buildings were built. And the really great buildings of the past were actually organic, expressive buildings of their own time and place. And there are even things to be learned from them in terms of form and proportions that are as valuable today as they would be years ago. And Sullivan took that all in. This building, actually, if you look, it derives very much kind of a family resemblance to many of the country churches of Russia, many of which were wood. And the whole concept, we were talking with Father John about this, about the idea of the bell tower as one building and then the sanctuary in the other, and then they kind of became combined, but this building still has the defined tower, the connector, then the sanctuary at the very center of it. And then the details with the belfry and the way that it works with the little details and the windows. There's actually specific buildings in country churches in Russia that you can pick out the windows from in other parts, but all given very much Sullivan's personal interpretation and creativity. So it's not a copy, but it is expressive. It is a building that looked to the new dawn of the 20th century, yet at the same time respected and looked to the past. It was a balance. It was something Sullivan did very deliberately. It wasn't because Sullivan was made to do a building that looked to the older churches of Russia in that tradition, but that is how you would do it. That is what was appropriate. That's what would be part of the reverence and the building fitting like a glove and being comfortable, yet at the same time looking forward. Now, as completed, the building was a little different than Sullivan had intended it to be. Now, if you look at the building today, it's all painted white with yellow trim. Now, if you take a look at the original rendering, actually the original renderings are lost. You only have some black and white photographs of them, and they show that characteristic of Sullivan's work, that it was to be stenciled on the outside and painted with beautiful decorative design. Sullivan did beautiful stenciling. I'm sure you've seen it at the Art Institute of Chicago in the old Stock Exchange trading room, where you put colors on a wall and you can actually enliven and even give depth to a wall through them. And the outside of the building, the base of the building, to apply the stencil, they actually, when this building was first built, the main body of the church was painted red. The tower, according to the descriptions, was painted blue. The upper part of the building was painted green. I'm trying to remember the parish house. I think that might have been yellow. And then the idea was at a later date, as money came in, that they would apply decoration to it. So this is quite a beautiful, bright building, but they didn't have the money to do the final work on it. So it was this building with these amazing colored forms. On the inside, to get it done, there was not the money to be able to finish the building. And if you were in here on the first days that the church opened in the spring of 1903, the walls would have been calcimine, which is a water-washable paint, in kind of a light pink with no ornamentation whatsoever except for a little blue border that went around the edges. And all of this woodwork here that has this marbleizing it was done in kind of a gray and then finished lightly to be imitative of stone. The idea was that as money was raised, they would be able to finish the decorative designs of the building. The light fixtures that you see here are the originals, but even the chandelier was not here at the time the building was built. Now, Sullivan had an amazing collaborator who worked with him going back even before the auditorium building, a man by the name of Louis Millet. Louis Millet was born in New York. trained at the École des Beaux-Arts. In fact, he was there at the same time with Louis Sullivan, and they were very close friends and collaborators. In fact, when Sullivan had a job to do, like designing the auditorium building, or any project where he needed interior decoration, Louis Millet shared Sullivan's idea of creating something new, of time and place and out of yourself, with color. And it was really the case of good collaboration, where the two would be kind of joined just like this and create together. So in the case of a building where you maybe want to have an impression of height, but you can't physically have all the height you want, you can fade colors and do things to create that height. And so Millet and Sullivan used to work things out so that when the building was designed with a Millet interior design, it was designed that those two would be unified. The hope was that Millet could be brought in to do the work. Now, the other thing Millet did was he was a glassmaker. And one thing that was finished and complete at the time this building was opened in early 1903 were the leaded glass windows. Now, this is really, if you look at windows like this, you're used to seeing windows like this that are simple, geometric, and straightforward. But think about what church windows looked like in 1903. They would be more ornamental, florid, and very much kind of just romantic little decorative forms just for the sake of being there. The geometry of these windows, where you're used to seeing things like that, is really very forward-looking for its time, and in some ways might have even been kind of a shock in some ways at its simplicity. In fact, many people have said even how there was the influence of Sullivan's most illustrious student, Frank Lloyd Wright, that even the evidence of some of his work starts to appear in the work of Louis Sullivan, and also through the windows created by Louis Millet. Now, the other wonderful thing with this is to create a sense of intimacy and sanctuary, and these are the eyes of the building. But it does make a sanctuary so you don't see the distraction of the outside. When this building was built, there wasn't even much around it. And so this wonderful screen that actually the colors enhance and actually suggest the idea of sunlight. And Sullivan was wonderful in figuring out things. I just look at even the difference in here. And one of the beauties of this, in fact, when I was here for one of the restoration phases, is to spend the day in here. In fact, I would almost recommend, if there was a way, if you ever have the hour, you've been able to do it, is spend the day here and watch how the space changes. As part of that thought process, Sullivan was very much cognizant of all of these things. The other thing that's interesting about Sullivan that sets his buildings apart is this all-inclusive thought process. Louis Sullivan could think in 3 dimensions. When he was planning a building in his mind and working it out and sketching it, almost like you've seen these computer generations where you can move through space and go up and down, he could do that in his mind. He could reconcile space. So it wasn't just plan and elevation. Not everybody can do that. It's just like people say, can you dream in color or black and white? And some people dream in black and white and some in color. There's very few people that have the talent to be able to mentally move through space and in doing it, create an emotionally expressive space at the same time. So he could see this in 3 dimensions in his mind before the building was ever built. Now, there are other architects who couldn't do this, and you can, if you're good, you can reconcile plan and elevation, and you can kind of build it just by kind of the logic of reconciling the two. But to be able to create it all at once as an organic whole, that's wonderful. And the whole idea of a journey, an event, and walking through the door into the small space. And then everything with Sullivan is about transitions. So you're in the very confined vestibule. Then you go into this area here under the balcony, which actually is a little bigger, more expansive space. That's then the transition into this larger space with this curved ceiling that draws you further into the space. And then it's from this progression in that you're into this space here, which at one way expresses reverence and reaches these wonderful arches to the sky. yet at the same time, it's like it reaches around everybody. And so it's very intimate, and it's almost as if the building embraces you. These are all, yes, 2 more minutes. Okay, then we've got it, great. Now, the one thing I'm going to finish with this story is it's kind of the sad story. We have the tangible building. Louis Millet came in 1 year and did the stencils, and these have been restored to the way they looked, and all of this finish is the way that Millet wanted to do it, and in many years it's been recovered. Now, there's a sad story to this. Louis Sullivan was never really understood in his time. He wasn't understood after his time. People made him out to be things that he wasn't, and he was very high on principles in teaching and inspiring others, but people weren't listening. He was discouraged. His work, it wasn't that it fell out of fashion, but it wasn't a thing about style. Sullivan didn't believe that anything had a style. He would say this building doesn't have a style. It is an expression of what it is for this building. And in the end, he didn't get jobs. He had to give up his office in the auditorium tower. He went from having a beautiful house on Lake Park Avenue. In the end, he was living in a hotel in a room that some people said was a linen closet with no rooms, that he couldn't even pay the rent. He would not compromise his ideals. He would not look to the past and copy things for the sake of copying them. He would not work the popular styles. He preached and he talked about enlightening everybody's ideals. It didn't happen. And he died lonely and almost, in some ways, forgotten in 1924. The same people that looked forward, Father Kucherov, left Holy Trinity in 1907. Here was this man who had seen the vision of a new idea, a new time, new place, as Sullivan had for architecture, for the Orthodoxy in America, traveled around the community, across the continents to build. He was then sent to Russia. And just after the Bolshevik Revolution, there's different variations on the story, conducting a service or taken away. He refused to back off from his ideals or have the services interrupted, and he was taken away and shot. And Bishop Tikhon, he also went back to Russia in 1907. Another man who shared the same ideals as Sullivan, and whose ideals, along with Father Kucherov's, were part of the energy that Sullivan was able to take into himself and give in this building, went back to Russia. In 1917, the year of the Bolshevik Revolution, he was made the unenviable job in many ways, a difficult job, but one that had to be done, and he took with bravery to be the Patriarch of Russia, of Moscow, and the head of the church. For his efforts, when the Tsar was murdered, he protested. When church property was being seized, he protested. When there was interventions to compromise the church by the Bolsheviks, he resisted them. He fought them, and for his efforts, he was actually then put into, basically imprisoned in a monastery, where he had, from 1922 to 23, he basically couldn't leave. In fact, till the end of his life in 1925, where he was so weakened by the experience, and actually by many counts, he was actually poisoned, that it was a similar sort of end to Bishop Tikhon as well. Now, Father Kucherov has now been canonized, who actually spoke right at the place where I'm speaking now to you, was canonized by the Orthodox Church in 1994. He is a saint. Bishop Tikhon was canonized, and he became a saint in 1989. These are the very important sainted figures of the Orthodox Church in recognition of what they did and what they gave up. Louis Sullivan is now being celebrated on his 150th birthday as one of the great architects, and people are understanding his ideas and his ideals. So the end story for Louis Sullivan, Bishop Tikhon, Father Kachurov, now Saint Tikhon and Saint Kachurov, for the Tsar of Russia, who also was saint. You can always say we've got 3 saints connected with this building. They had sad ends and a tragedy. However, the ideas and the ideals that they stood for was something that could never be taken away, and they still will be talked about, learned from, and it's not like dead history. What Sullivan and Saint Kachurov and Saint Tikhon stood for and their ideals still stands. We have the tangible manifestation of it here, what was created with their own hands at the time, and it's still here to inspire you. But even more importantly, what they stood for and their ideals and their commitment is something that no matter what happened to them, that could never destroy, and it still lives on today. So that's the story of Louis Sullivan, Holy Trinity, and the Saints. Thank you very much.